So today we're going to do the machine stitching sample. And you have 6 directions to follow on your machine stitching sample worksheet, and you have a drawing to take a look at to see exactly what you're supposed to do. So in the first step it says to get a 6-inch piece of fabric and to thread the machine with a thread cover that will show up on your fabric. So I chose white because that shows up nicely on the black fabric. Make sure that the machine's pattern selector is set at the straight stitch, which mine is, and then make sure that your stitch length is set at 2.5 or between the 2 and the 3, which mine is also. So the third step tells us to begin in the middle of a side. So you are actually going to start your stitching in the middle of one of these sides, not at a corner, but right in the middle of a side. And it doesn't matter which side you start at, but make sure you're starting in the middle so you can pivot around all 4 corners. And then it tells us that you are going to stitch 1/2 inch from the edge all the way around the square, carefully turning square corners. So we're going to use a 5/8 inch stitching line, and that is the guideline, stitching guideline on your throat plate. So 4/8 for the schoolmate, and then if you're using a Viking, it's a 10. And you see I'm starting right in the middle of a side, lining my fabric edge up with the 4/8 inch seam allowance markings on my throat plate, and then when I begin stitching, I'm going to back stitch. I'm just going to go forward about 4 stitches and back about 4 stitches, and then I'm going to continue coming forward, keeping my fabric lined up with the 4/8 inch seam allowance marking. And then when I get close to the corner, I'm going to make sure that my needle is down in the fabric, lift the presser foot, turn, and I am just like 1 stitch away from the 4/8. So I take 1 stitch with my hand wheel and turn. And then I am going to continue stitching from that corner down to the next, keeping my fabric lined up with the 4/8 inch seam allowance. And when I get close, I make sure my needle is down in my fabric. Lift up the presser foot, turn, and I'm about 1 stitch away, so I take 1 stitch with my hand wheel, and then pivot, and then continue on down the next row, or edge. And when I get close, I want to check, making sure my needle is down in the fabric. And there we go. And we're going to continue stitching. And then when I get to this section, I notice that these tails of thread that I started with are kind of getting in my way. So I'm going to go ahead and clip those close to the fabric without cutting a hole in my fabric. Put those in my trash bin and continue sewing to the corner. I'm close, so I'm going to check. It looks like I have about 1 stitch with the hand wheel. And I always make sure my needle's down in the fabric when I pivot, and when I start sewing again, that I have the presser foot down, and I'm just going to actually overlap that stitching that I started with. Just a couple stitches overlapping, and then I'm going to back stitch when I finish stitching. And then if I start to pull and my fabric doesn't come out easily, I'm going to use my hand wheel and make sure that my needle is in the upmost position, and then I can easily pull out my fabric, and then I can clip those threads close. And the next thing that I need to do inside the square is to stitch 4 rows of straight stitching with back stitch when you begin and when you end. So there's not a seam allowance. I'm just going to be inside of my square, making sure I'm not overlapping any previous stitches, and I'm just sewing a straight line as straight as possible. So when I start, I'm back stitching about 4 stitches or 1/2 inch. And then I sew down until I'm close to the other stitching line down here at the edge, and then I back stitch, pull out, and I'm cutting close to my fabric, but I'm not cutting a hole in my fabric. And it's a good idea to clip your stitches, your threads, as you go, so you don't have all this thread tangled up underneath you. So that's one. Then I'm going to do another. Back stitching when I start, going all the way down, about the same length, but it doesn't have to be exact. Back stitching, pulling out, clipping my threads on the front and the back, nice and close, but not cutting a hole in my fabric. And then I have 2 more to go. So I just allow a little bit of space each time. And remember, if you try to remove your thread and it hangs up like this, turn the hand wheel towards you a little bit and it'll loosen up. Continue clipping those threads as you go. Otherwise it really gets messy by the time you have this many seam lines going. And we have our final one. So I back stitch when I start sewing, stitch at the end. Remember, it's not a race. You're graded on how good you do, not on how fast you get finished. So that is my final length of stitching, and I check to make sure I don't have any stitching laying anywhere, and then I see that it says staple your sample here. Well, I don't want to staple the 2 pages together. This is the rubric page. So I lay my fabric sample on top, and I make sure I'm only stapling through the first layer, put my name at the top, and I'm ready to turn in my stitching sample on the machine.